What is going on, everybody? This is NASCAR railfan and Fly back with another video here. And as you can see, today we are going to be talking about the Canadian National Mainline of Mid-America. Now, this is probably going to be a very long episode here, but we'll just mainly be touching up on like the parts of Southern Illinois, and we'll even go up to the Central Illinois as well. We will be talking about the CN Champaign subdivision. Mainly, we'll be talking about the CN Centralia subdivision, the Champaign subdivision, and the Edgewood cutoff, also known as the Blueford subdivision. We may even be talking about other secondary lines that split off of the Champaign subdivision or Centralia sub, such as the Effingham subdivision, or the St. Louis subdivision, which I had done on a separate video, if you would like to see that, or the Eldorado subdivision, and many more. So before we talk about like Mainline of Mid-America and stuff, we'll go ahead and learn about its previous owner before Canadian National took over. The Illinois Central Railroad previously owned the line. The Illinois Central was discovered in 1851 and the line was completed in 1856, making it the longest railroad in the world at that time. The Illinois Central Railroad would always wear the black and white schemes, which is called the Death Stars. In 1972, it merged with the Gulf Mobile and Ohio Railroad to make the Illinois Central Gulf, and the Illinois Central engines you'd see would be orange and white instead, like this. But then, in 1988, the two railroads unmerged and Illinois Central retained its name. Until that was when Canadian National acquired the Illinois Central Railroad 10 years later in 1998 for $2.4 billion in cash. And the operations began on July 1st, 1999. But for the Illinois Central Railroad, the Illinois Central Railroad still technically exists, but just as a paper corporation, similar to the Joppa and the Eastern Railroad. Although they do have rolling stock. The Illinois Central Railroad, some of their locomotives still remain. There are still some Jeeps in original paint, and there are also over 30 Illinois Central SD70s still wearing the original Death Star paint scheme. Some others have been repainted, and IC 1006, 1013, 1014, and 1023 have all been scrapped due to getting wrecked in a derailment. The Illinois Central also used different train symbols at one time. For example, the Canadian National Local L51391 from Fulton, Kentucky to Paducah, Kentucky was known as FUPD in Illinois Central terms. So now that we know a little bit of history about the Illinois Central Railroad, let's go ahead and talk about the subdivisions here on the Mainline of Mid-America. So to first start, we are going to start with the more busy one, the Centralia subdivision / the Champaign subdivision. So the Mainline of Mid-America itself goes from Chicago, Illinois, all the way to New Orleans, Louisiana. But we're mainly going to be touching up on the parts of the lines in Southern and Central Illinois. So in the Southern Illinois area, it was called the Centralia subdivision until you got to Cairo, Illinois, where it became the Cairo subdivision. And the Centralia sub ended in Sandoval, and from then on it became the Champaign subdivision, and eventually went up further north and became the Chicago subdivision. So we'll go ahead and start with the Centralia and Champaign subdivisions here. So first off, let's go ahead and look at the train symbols that the Canadian National runs today. So for starters, there are 4 daily Amtrak trains that run. Amtrak trains P059 and P058, the city of New Orleans, and the Illini P390 and P393. And recently, P391 and P392 were abolished. So Amtrak 59 goes from Chicago to New Orleans, while 58 does the opposite since they're counterparts. And 393 goes from Chicago to Carbondale, Illinois, while 390 does the opposite the next morning. As for long-haul mixed freights, there are two northbound long-haul mixed freights, M396-71 and M335-71. There are four more mixed freights but are short-hauled. There's A431-71 and A432-91. Then there is also A408-91 and A407-71. There are various grain train symbols like G887, G889. There are countless grain symbols that always run through here on the Centralia subdivision. Some grain trains are even southbounds, even though most southbounds will take the Edgewood cutoff. As for intermodal trains, there are two different intermodal trains on the CN Centralia subdivision that both head northbound. Q197-71 and Z195-71. This one is classified with a Z instead of a Q because it is a higher priority intermodal train. There are also Canadian National locals that run to south of Centralia, Illinois. The only CN local that runs north of Centralia, Illinois is a grain shuttle to Farina, Illinois known as L500-91. But that train rarely ever runs. But south of Centralia, Illinois, there are way more Centralia sub-locals that will go to other lines. For example, CN train L588-91, which really isn't on a set schedule, runs randomly and will take the Eldorado subdivision. And then there is also a few other trains such as L546, L548, and L504, and L544, which all serve the St. Louis subdivision. I would talk about the St. Louis subdivision, but I already did a documentary on that in one of my Subdivisions of Southern Illinois episodes. If you'd like to see that, that will be in the description. And then the last two locals are CN L590 and L591, which I am unsure of where they go, but they do originate in Centralia, Illinois. The CN Centralia subdivision will also sometimes get coal trains. BNSF will send two different kinds of coal trains to the CN using a connection track in Centralia, Illinois. CN coal train C74191, which goes south to Baldwin, Illinois. Enjoy these while you can, because the Baldwin plant eventually plans to close. Then there are also BNSF coal trains that go to Newton, Illinois. They will head south on the CN and then return north about 30 minutes to an hour later and head up to Newton, Illinois and take the Effingham subdivision, which is also where CN local L533-91 runs at. This CN coal train symbol is known as C731 and will come back south the next day and return to the BNSF as C730. On the other hand, for CN coal train C744 that goes to the St. Louis sub, it returns north the next day, known as CN C745. But that's not the only purpose for the connection track that was used in Centralia, Illinois between the BNSF and the CN. CN will also send a small yard job over to the BNSF to exchange cars with the BNSF yard job YCEI 101. CN will send cars to the BNSF and go into the BNSF yard, and sometimes the opposite will happen and BNSF will instead go into the CN yard. There is an old branch line that splits off of the CN Centralia subdivision outside of Central City in Junction City, Illinois. And that is the old IC charter line, also known as the Decatur subdivision, that ran up to Decatur, Illinois. The reason why they probably took out this line, since it runs to Decatur, Illinois, they probably didn't need this line anymore because they already have another line that runs to Decatur, Illinois. And that is the CN Peoria subdivision. But it's not a very busy line. All they get is a local, coal trains from the Union Pacific, and some grain trains such as G870 and G871, which will take the Centralia subdivision and head over to the St. Louis subdivision. But the old IC Decatur subdivision, there is no particular reason why it shut down. Some of the lines still remain standing outside of Centralia, Illinois, but the rest of the line is torn up except for Vandalia, Illinois. That part of the line is still in service and owned by the Vandalia Railroad, which only runs a few times a month, just like the Heron Railroad. There is no particular reason of why the line shut down, as I said, but if I had to guess, I'd say it might be because of the Peoria subdivision, because that line also goes to Decatur and it's owned by CN. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the as-needed trains that run on the CN Centralia subdivision. A lot of the as-needed trains that run on the line are unit trains, but there are other trains that aren't really considered unit trains, such as potash trains. For example, there are two different as-needed potash trains that run on the Centralia sub, B788-91 running south, and B789-71 running northbound on the Centralia sub. The other unit trains that run on there is northbound U701-71, U723-71, which is an iron ore train, U701 is a coke train, and then two crude oil trains that come from the Kansas City Southern, U757-71 and U759-71. Then CN has their own crude oil train called U261, and their counterpart, U260, will take the Bluford subdivision. A lot of these as-needed northbound trains will have southbound counterparts, but will take the Edgewood cutoff. The Centralia sub mainly consists of the northbound trains, and the Edgewood cutoff consists of the southbound trains, but the Edgewood cutoff isn't near as busy as the Centralia subdivision. And maybe I'll go ahead and do another Subdivisions of Southern Illinois episode on the CN Bluford sub, also known as the Edgewood cutoff. But anyways, I hope I didn't forget anything about the CN Centralia subdivision. But thanks all so much for watching, and now that you've learned about the Centralia subdivision, I will go ahead and show you a compilation of different trains on the CN Centralia subdivision. And eventually, I will get to the CN Bluford subdivision.